if the toys we played with as children weren't as innocent as we thought? What if they held secrets, memories, or even spirits that refused to let go? This is the story of the Crying Doll, a chilling tale that will make you question every doll you've ever seen. It begins with a woman named Emily, who thought she'd found a simple treasure at a garage sale. But what she brought home wasn't just a toy. It was a doorway to something dark, something that wept in the night. So dim the lights, lock your doors, and let's uncover a nightmare that started with a pair of glass eyes that wouldn't stop crying. Emily Carter lived a quiet life in Portland, Oregon. At 28, she taught third grade at a local elementary school, filling her small apartment with little treasures she found at thrift stores and garage sales. She loved the idea that every item had a story, a past life she could imagine. On a cold, drizzly Saturday in November, she drove to a garage sale she'd seen posted on a community board. The house was old, its windows boarded up, the front yard cluttered with boxes of forgotten things. An elderly man sat on the porch, his face weathered, his eyes distant as he watched her approach. Emily wandered through the piles, picking up a cracked teapot and a faded scarf, but nothing really stood out. Then, in the corner of a table, half hidden under a pile of old newspapers, she saw it. A doll. It was about 2 feet tall, made of porcelain, with a pale face and glass eyes that seemed to shimmer in the gray light. Its dress was tattered, a once white lace now yellowed with age, and its blonde hair was tangled into knots. A faint crack ran across its cheek, giving it a mournful look. Emily picked it up, feeling its surprising weight. The porcelain was cold, almost icy, against her hands. She turned to the old man. "How much for the doll?" she asked. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Take it," he said, his voice rough. "I don't want it here." Emily thought he was joking, but his tone was serious, almost desperate. She smiled awkwardly, thanked him, and tucked the doll under her arm. As she drove home, she kept glancing at it on the passenger seat. Those glass eyes seemed to follow her, catching the light in a way that made her skin crawl. She told herself she was being silly. It was just a doll, after all. That night, she placed it on a shelf in her living room, thinking it might make a cute decoration. But around midnight, as she lay in bed, she heard something. A soft, broken sob, like a child crying in the distance. It was coming from the living room. Emily sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The sobbing stopped as soon as she turned on the lamp. She crept into the living room, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The doll was still on the shelf, its glass eyes glinting in the dim light. She stared at it, waiting, but the sound didn't come again. "It's just my imagination," she whispered to herself, trying to laugh it off. She went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next night, it happened again. This time, the crying was louder, more distinct, like a child in pain. Emily grabbed her phone, turned on the flashlight, and tiptoed to the living room. The doll hadn't moved, but its face looked different somehow. Sadder. She stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. That's when she saw it. A single drop of water glistening on the doll's porcelain cheek, as if it had been crying. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and wiped the drop away. It was real, cold and wet against her skin. Her stomach twisted. She yanked the doll off the shelf and stuffed it into a drawer in her bedroom, slamming it shut. "It's just condensation," she told herself, though she didn't believe it. The next morning, she opened the drawer to check. The doll was there, but it was sitting upright, facing her, with more water stains on its face. Emily's hands shook as she pulled it out. The crying started again that night, louder and more desperate, echoing through the apartment. She tried to ignore it, but around 2 a.m., she heard something new. A voice, small, fragile, barely a whisper. "Emily," it said. "Help me." She froze, her blood running cold. The voice was coming from the drawer. She opened it, and the doll's glass eyes were locked on her, more tears streaming down its cracked face. Emily slammed the drawer shut and called her friend Sarah, her voice shaking as she explained everything. Sarah tried to calm her down. "It's just a doll," she said. "Maybe there's a mechanism inside, like a music box or something." But Emily knew it wasn't a mechanism. She could feel it watching her, even through the closed drawer. Emily couldn't live with it anymore. The next day, she drove back to the house where she'd gotten the doll. The old man was still on the porch, rocking in his chair, staring at the rain. She stormed up to him, the doll clutched in her hands. "What is this thing?" she demanded. "Why is it crying? Why does it know my name?" The man sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Sit down," he said, his voice heavy. "I'll tell you." He explained that the doll had belonged to his younger sister, Clara, who died in 1952 at the age of 7. Clara loved the doll, carried it everywhere, even talked to it like it was her best friend. But after she passed, strange things started happening. The family would hear crying at night, always coming from the doll. They thought it was Clara's spirit, unable to move on. They tried to destroy it, threw it into a fire, but the next morning, it was back in Clara's room, untouched. They buried it in the backyard, but it reappeared on the kitchen table. Eventually, they locked it in the attic, hoping to forget it. When the man inherited the house, he found the doll and decided to get rid of it. "I tried to warn you," he said, "but no one ever believes me." Emily felt a wave of nausea. She left the doll on the porch and drove home, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. That night, she thought it was over. But at 3 a.m., the crying started again. She turned on the light, and there it was, sitting on her bedside table, its glass eyes staring at her, tears dripping onto the wood. "Help me, Emily," it whispered, its voice louder, more desperate. She screamed, grabbed the doll and threw it into the hallway. It hit the wall with a crack, its porcelain arm breaking off, but the crying didn't stop. It turned into a wail, a piercing scream that filled the apartment. Emily called Sarah again, begging her to come over. Sarah arrived, her face pale as she saw the doll on the floor, its broken arm leaking water like blood. "We need to end this," Sarah said. They drove to a lake outside town, tied the doll to a brick, and threw it into the water. The wails faded as it sank. They thought they were free, but the next morning, Emily woke up to find the doll on her couch, soaking wet, its cracked face staring at her. That night, Sarah disappeared. Emily went to her apartment and found it empty, except for the doll, sitting in the middle of the living room, its glass eyes now glowing faintly. And in the silence, she heard it whisper her name one last time. Emily vanished a few days later. Her apartment was found empty, her belongings untouched. The doll was gone too. Some say it's still out there, waiting in a thrift store or a garage sale, carrying Clara's spirit with it. Others believe Emily and Sarah are trapped with it, their voices now but part of the cries that echo in the night. If you ever find a porcelain doll with glass eyes and a cracked face, don't take it home. You might hear it cry. What do you think happened to Emily? Could you face the crying doll? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you dare, subscribe for more stories that'll keep you up at night. See you in the next one, if you're brave enough.